requirement is that it must have a relatively high Curie temperature. In other words, it's got to remain a permanent magnet up to a fairly high temperature, because if you're under the hood of an automobile, your temperatures could be as high as 180 degrees centigrade. So we arbitrarily set a Curie temperature of at least 250 degrees centigrade. In addition, we must use to have an economically viable magnet, it must use one of the abundant, low-cost rare earths like praseodymium or neodymium. This is a breakdown of the composition of the rare earths that are obtained from a bastnasite ore in Bayonne Obo mine in Inner Mongolia, which is the largest rare earth mine in the world. And you can see that neodymium is about 18.5%, praseodymium about 6.2%, but samarium is only 0.8%. That's why samarium is relatively expensive. Now the first thing you might ask is, well, why don't you use these two, cerium and lanthanum, or much more abundant? And the reason is that the high coercivity in the rare earth transition metal permanent magnets results from the highly anisotropic 4F wave functions, electric wave functions, one of which I've shown here. You can see it's very highly anisotropic. However, lanthanum and cerium have no 4F electrons. Therefore, the 4F wave function is simply a sphere. Therefore, they'd had lanthanum and cerium would have, since they have no 4F electrons, have no magnetocrystalline anisotropy and no coercivity. Incidentally, the magnetocrystalline anisotropy is basically the field, the magnetic field that it takes to pull, oops, what am I doing here? To pull this magnetic moment from the C direction down into the basal plane. And this can be as high as 250,000 Gauss, very high in something like samarium cobalt 5.
This is really technical.
What is
John.
anisotropic?
Anisotropic means it's different in one direction than another.
Oh, okay.
Isotropic means it's the same in all directions. As I mentioned, there was a serious problem, and that had to do with the fact that there was unlike samarium cobalt 5, which is an intermetallic compound, there were no suitable intermetallic compounds for the rare earth iron materials. I plotted all the rare earths and shown the rare earth intermetallic binary compounds it formed. There's a rare earth iron 2, rare earth iron 3, 623, and 217. As I mentioned, the cubic phases are not suitable for permanent magnets, so we're left with these two. But you can see that for praseodymium and neodymium, there's only two intermetallic compounds formed, the 217s, and they have very low Curie temperature. So people that were working in this field looked at this kind of data, and we didn't know where to begin. We had to have a suitable an intermetallic compound to start with. So there seemed to be no way at all of starting this research on these permanent magnet materials. However, one day, I and a colleague found this publication in the paper, which shows, it was by Arthur Clarke. He was at the Naval Ordnance Laboratory. It shows the annealing. What he did was he prepared amorphous or rapidly solidified terbium iron 2. He annealed it, and suddenly at a certain temperature, coercivity jumped up to about 3.5 kiloworsted. This was very exciting research to us, because this was the first incidence of magnetic hardening of a rare earth iron binary phase. It was also interesting because terbium iron 2 is a cubic phase and should not have developed any coercivity. As I mentioned, cubic materials shouldn't be able to develop into a permanent magnet. Therefore, the coercivity was believed to be almost certainly due to the formation of a new magnetically hard metastable phase. In other words, a non-equilibrium phase. I think most of the people there at the conference will understand that, but I don't suppose most of you would. So this work became the genesis of the research project at the General Motors Research Labs to investigate the possible formation of metastable phases in melt-spun neodymium iron and praseodymium iron. And that's what I did for the next 5 years. So in the late 1970s, I began investigating the possibility of producing metastable, magnetically hard neodymium iron and praseodymium iron using the melt spinning process. And this was a fairly new process where you take a molten alloy, you use pressurized argon, and you direct a stream of it onto a rapidly rotating cold rim, and you produce this fine ribbon. which is rapidly solidified. And this is the first melt spinner that I had built at one of the shops at the General Motors Research Labs. And again, it's the same thing what we saw. Small 6-inch diameter copper disc, a quartz crucible that's heated inductively, a cap on the top. You melt the material, pressurize it, and it drives the metal onto this disc to produce this ribbon-like material that you see here. And of course the wheel is turned with this drive motor. And I also might mention that this entire process has to be carried out inside a vacuum because at high temperature, any rare earth material is highly reactive with oxygen. So in the late 1970s to early 1980s, I carried out this kind of work, and I discovered that magnetically hard metastable phases readily formed in all of the rare earth iron binary alloys when melt spun over a range of quench rate. In other words, I would change the speed of that rim, and that's called the range of the quench rate in V sub s, which is in meter seconds of substrate velocity. You can see that the coercivity force developed as high as 8 kiloworsted. I had found coercivity as high as 20 kiloworsted, certainly the highest that had ever been discovered. But the most important thing was that when I was doing this work, I started, like most material scientists, I started adding things to try to make it a little different. And I added boron to one of these alloys, and I discovered this neodymium-2 iron-14 boron intermetallic compound, which is the basis of all neodymium iron permanent magnets. It's ferromagnetic with a reasonably high Curie temperature. I said we had to have a high Curie temperature. It has uniaxial crystal structure, tetragonal, very high magnetic strength, the highest of any material ever discovered, of a permanent magnet material ever discovered. Iron itself is over 220, and then a very high magnetocrystalline anisotropy of 79,000 gals. So as I said, this intermetallic compound was my major discovery, and as I say, it is the basis of all permanent magnet, of neodymium iron boron permanent magnets today.
Is anybody in your lab taking video the day you figured this out? Were you jumping up and down?
No, I don't think so.
That's too bad.
So one of the things immediately following this, we began thinking about the commercial development of this material. The magnetic powder from this ground melt spun neodymium iron boron ribbon was found to produce very high performance epoxy bonded magnets. In other words, we would take the powder and turn them into these permanent magnets. There was immediate interest in Delco Remy, which was the division in General Motors that made most of those motors that you saw on the car for the car. They wanted to see if you could use these magnets to reduce the weight and size of these various motors. So the decision was made to develop the production melt spinning process in Delco Remy, Anderson, Indiana. And so over the next couple of years, I actually went to Delco Remy, starting in late 1983, and between 1984 and 85, using this, as you can see, somewhat larger melt spinner, but this is simply a prototype. We developed the technology for producing this ribbon in high volume. Oops, I did it again. I can't see my buttons here.
Good practice for tomorrow.
Well, I hope I do a better job tomorrow. We also developed a technology for producing bonded neodymium magnets, which included blending the material with an epoxy. We compact it in a compaction press. We then cure the epoxy. We spray coat it because it has to be protected from the environment. And then this is the coated ring magnets that we finally end up. These are the magnets that are used in these various motors. In terms of commercial development, we founded the MagnaQuench business unit at Delco Remy, Anderson, Indiana in 1986. We built and installed the first generation production melt spinners in a new factory built in Anderson, Indiana. And the first sales of melt spun magnetic powder to Japanese companies started in 1987. And this is just some of the first applications, very first applications for this material. This is a small motor for an autofocus for both still and motion cameras. This is US dime. This is also a very famous but old, now extinct process. This is the read write, the stepper motor for the read write on the floppy disk drive. Again, maybe I think most of the people in this room remember the floppy disk drive when it was a major mean, but at one point in time, we used a lot of this powder making these tiny little motors, but again, that's completely extinct today. Today, the major applications for this material, again, most of the products are these types of ring magnets. They go into the spindle motor that goes into your hard disk drive, and also bonded ring magnets that go into stepper motors that go into, stepper motors that go into a printer. So it's very hard for you to go through a day unless you're really inactive without using some of these magnets somewhere in your life, particularly if you're active on a computer. Just to conclude now, Magnequench, the beginning of Magnequench, particularly the commercial development of the business, coincided with the early development of the personal computer, the personal PC, and related office equipment, printers and scanners and fax machines that were needed to work with the PC. So between 1987 and 1995, there was a considerable increase in sales, and the future looked bright for the company. But then suddenly in 1995, GM suddenly announced that they were selling Magnequench because it was not core to the automotive business. And I might point out that although neodymium and iron boron magnets were much cheaper than samarium cobalt 5, they were still considered too expensive for high volume automotive use. So at that time, they didn't think they could use them a lot on automobiles. So the business was eventually sold to a group of investors which included elements of the Chinese government. In fact, the son-in-law of the chairman of Deng Xiaoping's son-in-law was one of the people that bought this company at the time. And eventually the entire business and technology was transferred by the new owners to a new factory in Tianjin, China in 2001. Following my talk is a talk by Victoria Bruce covering elements of her book Sellout. She talks about, she mentions Magnequench, but it's an example of the transfer of technology from the United States to China that occurred over the last couple of decades that she and I feel was not in the good interest of the United States. So I guess that's the end of my talk. How long was that?
I got